The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the tongue and clung to the pristine white of her dress. An Lee stood before the justice of the peace, a man whose breath smelled of stale whiskey and judgment, and felt the weight of 100 hostile eyes. They were not seeing her. They saw a debt, a transaction, a piece of exotic property sold to settle her father's foolish gambling losses. They saw the pale, frightened face of a girl from a land they could not comprehend, being bound to a man they understood only through fear. His name was Gabriel, and he stood beside her not as a groom, but as a finality. He was tall and rendered a stark silhouette by the unforgiving summer sun, his features shadowed by the brim of his hat. He had not spoken a single word to her. He had simply appeared at her father's failing laundry, laid a heavy bag of coins on the counter, and gestured toward her. The deal was done. Now, in the stifling heat of the makeshift courthouse, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and self-righteousness, the town had gathered to watch the culmination of the bargain. An Lee kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards, tracing its jagged path with her eyes, imagining it was a river that could carry her away from this place. The justice mumbled the words, a dry rustle of sound devoid of meaning. She felt a presence shift beside her, and a large calloused hand briefly touched her elbow, guiding her to turn. Gabriel's face was still in shadow, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, the unreadable darkness of his eyes. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He was a force of nature, like a storm on the horizon, and she was a sapling caught in its path. "I reckon that's that," the justice declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. The sound was a punctuation mark on her life, a full stop. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, a sound like cicadas, sharp and incessant. She was his now, the gunslinger's woman. An Lee drew a breath that felt like swallowing fire and finally lifted her head, meeting the collective gaze of the town of Redemption Creek. In their faces she saw contempt, pity, and a morbid curiosity. She was a spectacle. But as her eyes met Gabriel's for a fleeting second, she saw none of that. She saw nothing at all, just a vast, quiet emptiness that was somehow more terrifying than all the hatred combined. The walk to his home was a silent ordeal. He moved with a long, ground-eating stride, and An Lee had to take 2 steps for every one of his, the hem of her white dress gathering the red dust of the street. She did not dare to walk beside him, but followed a pace behind, like a shadow he was unaware he cast. The town watched their passage. Faces appeared in windows, framed by lace curtains. Men stopped their conversations outside the saloon to stare, their expressions unreadable, but their contempt palpable. The whispers followed them, curling in the heated air, words she could not quite make out, but whose venom she felt as keenly as a physical sting. His house stood at the very edge of town, isolated, as if the settlement itself were trying to shrink away from it. It was a simple, unpainted, clapboard structure, stark against the bleached yellow grass. There was no porch swing, no welcome mat, only a single stone step and a heavy wooden door. He unlocked it and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter first. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of soap and old wood. It was immaculately clean, but barren. A single large room held a table with 2 chairs, a cold hearth, and a narrow bed in the far corner, neatly made. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelf, no sign that a life was lived here beyond mere existence. He gestured toward a second door she hadn't noticed. "That is your room," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, and the sound was startling. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. He made no move toward her, his posture unthreatening but utterly uninviting. Gathering her courage, she walked to the door and pushed it open. The room was small, containing only a simple cot and a small crate for a table, but it was clean. A window looked out onto the parched land behind the house, and on the inside of the door there was a newly installed brass slide lock. Her eyes fixed on it, a small, gleaming object of profound significance. He had given her a lock, a barrier he could not cross. It was not a kindness, she thought, not yet. It was a boundary. He was marking his territory, and hers. She was a fixture in his house, but not a part of his life. The realization brought not comfort, but a colder, more profound sense of desolation. The first days passed in a suffocating silence, measured by the slow crawl of the sun across the barren floorboards. A new routine established itself without a single word being exchanged. Gabriel would rise before the dawn, his movements quiet and economical, and be gone before the first light touched her window. He left provisions on the kitchen table, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, sometimes a strip of dried meat. It was sustenance, not a meal. He would return long after dusk, a phantom slipping through the door, and would sit at the table, methodically cleaning his pistol in the dim lamplight. The soft, rhythmic click and slide of metal was the only sound in the house, a constant reminder of who he was and what he did. He never looked at her, never acknowledged her presence as she sat on her cot in her own small room, the door held slightly ajar. He ate whatever he had procured for himself and then retired to his own bed. He never tried her door. He never spoke her name, for he did not know it. An Lee felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his solitude. She was a prisoner in a jail with no bars, watched not by a guard, but by the suffocating weight of his indifference. She spent her hours exploring the confines of her world. The house was a testament to a man who owned nothing he didn't strictly need. The yard was a patch of cracked earth and stubborn weeds. A fence, its posts leaning, separated his property from the vast, empty prairie beyond. From her window she could see the town shimmering in the distance, a place she was now inextricably linked to, but utterly exiled from. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. But as the days bled into one another, a new feeling began to surface alongside it, a strange, hollow ache of non-existence. She was an object, a piece of furniture in this silent house. Her life, her thoughts, her very being had been erased. She had to do something, anything, to prove she was still there. She had to make a mark on this empty place, or she feared she would disappear completely into its silence. One afternoon, while he was gone, she found a small rusted trowel and a broken spade head in a dilapidated shed out back. Her hands, soft from years of folding laundry, were ill-suited for the task, but she began to work. She attacked the patch of sun-baked earth behind the house, the one visible from her window, her movements clumsy but determined. She would make something grow here. It was a desperate, foolish hope, a prayer offered to the unyielding soil. The work was brutal. The summer sun beat down on her, baking the back of her neck and soaking the thin white cotton of her dress with sweat. The ground was hard as stone, resisting her efforts with a stubborn finality. Her hands blistered, then broke open, the sting of the raw skin a sharp, grounding pain. But she did not stop. Every weed she pulled, every clod of earth she overturned, was a small victory against the crushing emptiness. It was an act of creation in a world defined by absence. She was not just clearing a patch of land, she was carving out a space for herself, a tiny square of existence that was hers alone. At first, she worked only in the afternoons, after the worst of the day's heat had passed, ensuring she was back in her room before he returned. But soon the garden became an obsession, a purpose. She rose with the same sun that saw him ride out, and worked until her muscles screamed and the blisters on her hands wept. The physical exhaustion was a balm, silencing the frantic thoughts that plagued her in the quiet house. One evening she worked too long, lost in the rhythm of the labor. The sky was bleeding purple and orange when she heard the soft thud of his horse's hooves. She froze, the rusty trowel clutched in her hand, her heart seizing with a familiar dread. He dismounted slowly, his movements weary. For a long moment he stood by his horse, his gaze fixed on her, then on the small, neatly cleared rectangle of dark, turned earth. She could not read his expression, shadowed as it was by his hat. She expected anger, or, at the very least, annoyance at her presumption. He said nothing. He simply unsaddled his horse and led it to the small lean-to that served as a stable. When he walked past her to enter the house, his eyes flickered once more to the patch of ground. An-Li retreated to her room, her body trembling, certain she had crossed some invisible line. She did not sleep that night, waiting for a confrontation that never came. The next morning, when she emerged from her room, a small burlap sack sat in the center of the kitchen table. It was not the usual loaf of bread or cheese. She approached it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she loosened the twine. Inside were seeds, tiny, dark specks of promise. Corn, beans, squash. There was no note, no explanation, just the seeds. It was a silent answer, a concession. It was the first conversation they had ever had. The seeds changed everything. They were a fragile truce, a shared secret in the silent house. Planting them felt like a sacred act. An-Li pushed each seed into the soil with her thumb, whispering a prayer for it to grow, to bring life to this desolate patch of earth. The garden became her sanctuary and her calendar, its slow, patient progress marking the passage of time more meaningfully than the rising and setting of the sun. The need for supplies grew, and with it the necessity of facing the town. Gabriel began leaving a few coins on the table alongside the daily provisions, another unspoken permission. Her first trip to the general store was an agony of exposure. The moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. Mrs. Gable, the sheriff's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, stopped measuring out flour, her eyes narrowing into judgmental slits. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. An-Li kept her eyes downcast, her face burning with shame. She placed her items on the counter, twine, a better spade, some salt, and pushed the coins forward. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson, took the money without meeting her eyes. The hostility in the air was thick enough to taste, a bitter, metallic tang of prejudice. As she left, she heard Mrs. Gable's stage whisper, "Living in sin with that killer. It's a disgrace." The words followed her all the way back to the quiet house on the edge of town. She did not cry. Instead, she poured her shame and anger into the soil, her hands working until they were raw. A few days later, a new threat emerged. A group of rough-looking men, drifters from the look of them, began to loiter on the path near the house in the late afternoons. They watched her work in the garden, their gazes invasive, their comments low and crude, carried on the hot breeze. An-Li ignored them, her back rigid, but fear coiled in her stomach. One afternoon their taunts grew bolder. One of them took a step toward the crumbling fence line. Suddenly a shadow fell over them. Gabriel was there. He had returned early, moving with an unnerving silence. He didn't speak. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood there, his hand resting loosely on his hip, his presence a wall of cold, lethal intent. The men froze, their bravado evaporating under his flat, unwavering stare. They muttered amongst themselves, then shuffled away, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Gabriel watched them go, then turned and walked into the house without a word or a look in her direction. His protection was as silent and as absolute as his judgment. The well pump was old and stubborn, demanding a strength she did not possess to draw more than a trickle of brackish water. Her burgeoning garden was thirsty, the young shoots beginning to wilt under the relentless sun. For days she had been carrying water in a leaky bucket from a small creek nearly half a mile away, an exhausting, back-breaking task that left her drained by midday. The problem sat like a stone in her chest, a logistical challenge she could not solve alone. She needed his help, and the thought of initiating contact, of breaking the carefully constructed silence that governed their lives, was terrifying. She practiced the words in her mind for 2 days, her courage failing each time he returned in the evening, his presence filling the small house with an intimidating quiet. Finally, one evening, she forced herself to act. He was at the table, cleaning his gun, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. She took a steadying breath and stepped out of her room. "The garden needs more water," she said. The words felt clumsy and loud in the stillness. He did not look up, but his hands stilled their meticulous work. The silence stretched, and she felt a flush of panic, certain she had misstepped. She had made a demand, a request, of a man to whom she was nothing but a responsibility he had acquired. She was about to retreat, to murmur an apology and flee back to her room, when he finally spoke, his voice a low rasp. "The well?" It was a single word, but it was an opening. "It does not work well," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "The handle is stiff. The water is slow." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and then resumed his task. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Anneli returned to her room, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and disappointment. He had not been angry, but he had offered no solution. The next day she woke to an unfamiliar sound, the rhythmic squeak and clank of metal on metal. Peeking out her window, she saw him at the well. He had disassembled the pump mechanism, the pieces laid out neatly on a piece of canvas. With a focused intensity, he cleaned and oiled each part, his large hands surprisingly deft. He worked for over an hour, and when he was done, he reassembled it, testing the handle. It moved smoothly, silently. He primed the pump, and with a few easy strokes, a thick, clear stream of water gushed into the stone basin. He watched it for a moment, then turned and left for the day, without a backward glance. That afternoon she found a new, sturdy bucket sitting beside the well. He had said nothing, but he had heard her, and he had provided. The clear, cool water from the repaired well was life itself. The young plants, once struggling, now drank deeply and responded with a surge of growth. Green shoots of corn pushed skyward, and the broad-veined leaves of the squash plants began to spread across the dark, cultivated earth. The garden, once a desperate act of defiance, was becoming a place of vibrant beauty, a testament to her persistence. It was a small green miracle on the edge of the desert. The transformation mirrored a subtle shift within the house. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer heavy with dread and uncertainty. It had become a shared space, a quiet understanding that required no words. Anneli, emboldened by the success of her garden, began to claim more of the house as her own. She started cooking proper meals in the evening, the simple ingredients he provided transformed by the memory of her mother's recipes. The aromas of ginger, garlic, and simmering vegetables filled the small cabin, chasing away the lingering scent of dust and solitude. The first night she did this, she left a bowl of rice and stew on the table for him. She watched from her partially open door as he returned. He stopped, looked at the bowl, and for a long moment she thought he would ignore it. He ate his own meager rations standing by the counter and then went to bed. The bowl remained untouched. Her heart sank. She had presumed too much. But the next night she tried again, and when she woke in the morning, the bowl was empty, washed clean, and set to dry by the sink. A silent acceptance, a silent thank you. She began to observe him more closely, not with the fear of a captive, but with the curiosity of a woman trying to understand the enigmatic man who was her husband. She saw the deep weariness in his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. She saw the way his eyes, so often cold and distant, would sometimes drift to the horizon, a profound and unshakable grief settling in them. He was not just a gunslinger. He was a man hollowed out by a past he kept locked away. He was an outcast, just as she was. The town feared him for his gun. They despised her for her face. They were two solitary islands, and this small house, with its blooming garden, was the fragile bridge beginning to form between them. She started leaving her bedroom door open a little wider in the evenings, a silent invitation not for intimacy, but for acknowledgement. She was no longer just a debt paid. She was a presence, a life in this house. The town's animosity, which had been simmering for weeks, finally boiled over on a sweltering Sunday morning. An Lee had walked into town for thread, a simple errand that she now undertook with a practiced air of composure, her gaze fixed forward, ignoring the whispers and stares. As she was leaving the general store, her path was blocked by a small assembly of the town's most righteous citizens, led by Reverend Miller and a stern-faced Mrs. Gable. The Reverend, a man whose piety was a weapon he wielded with relish, pointed a finger at her. "Woman," he boomed, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet street, "your presence here is a stain upon this community. You live in unwedded sin with a man of violence, a killer. You are a corrupting influence, a heathen temptation." An Lee clutched her small package, her knuckles white. In the past, she would have shrunk away, her silence her only shield. But weeks of turning the soil, of coaxing life from the barren ground, had cultivated a different kind of strength in her. She would not be silent. "We were married by the justice of the peace," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through his sanctimonious tone. "It is the law." Mrs. Gable scoffed, her face a mask of contempt. "A piece of paper means nothing. You are his property, a foreign plaything. You do not belong here among decent folk." The faces in the small crowd around them nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of fear and loathing. They were a wall of judgment, and she was alone. But as she looked at their twisted faces, she felt not fear, but a surge of cold anger. "I have done nothing to you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I have worked my land. I have spoken to no one. Your decency is a cloak for your hatred." A gasp went through the crowd. The Reverend's face turned a mottled red. "Blasphemy! She speaks against us!" he roared, taking a step forward. An Lee stood her ground, her chin lifted. It was in that moment of tense confrontation that a figure emerged from the alley beside the saloon. It was Gabriel. He moved with his customary silence, his long coat undisturbed by the breeze. The crowd parted for him instinctively, a ripple of fear disrupting their righteous mob. He did not look at them. He did not draw his gun. He simply walked to An Lee's side and stood there. His presence was a declaration. He did not touch her, did not speak a word, but his meaning was unmistakable. She was not alone. He was with her. The Reverend sputtered, his sermon cut short by a presence far more imposing than his own. Gabriel's cold, quiet gaze swept over them, and one by one, their own eyes fell away, unable to meet his. He had silenced them without a single threat. The following morning, Gabriel did not ride out of town. Instead, he put on a clean shirt and waited for her by the door. "Come," he said. It was not a request. Confused but obedient, An Li followed him. They walked not to the general store, but toward the center of town, to the dusty, weed-choked lot that sat between the church and the blacksmith shop. A crowd began to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of the gunslinger walking in broad daylight with his Chinese wife. Reverend Miller and Mrs. Gable were there, their faces tight with suspicion. The sheriff watched from the steps of his office. Gabriel ignored them all. He stopped in the center of the lot and turned to face the assembled townspeople. From his coat pocket, he produced a folded document. He unrolled it. It was a property deed, signed and sealed by the Territorial Land Office. "This land," Gabriel began, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness, "is barren, just like the minds of many in this town." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. "You fear what you don't understand. You condemn what is different. You preach community, but you practice exclusion." He held up the deed. "I have purchased this lot." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the town's leaders. "My wife and I," he said, and the word wife was spoken with a quiet, deliberate emphasis, "are giving this land to the town of Redemption Creek." He turned his head slightly to look at An Li, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "We will be funding the construction of a new schoolhouse right here." The crowd was stunned into absolute silence. "A school? From him?" "I will be paying the salary for a proper teacher to come from the East," he continued, his voice level and devoid of emotion. "And this school will be open to every child in this town, and any child who passes through it. No exceptions." He then did something that shattered their every preconception. He turned to An Li and held the deed out to her. "This is yours," he said, "for her alone to hear." Then he raised his voice again. "The deed will be held in my wife's name. It is her gift to you." He had not raised his voice. He had not issued a threat. He had answered their hatred not with violence, but with a radical act of generosity. He had shamed them with progress. He was investing in a future for their children, a future of education and tolerance that they themselves were too blind to build. The wedding gift was not a thing of gold or silver. It was a foundation, a future, and a resounding, unimpeachable rebuke that silenced the whole town. They walked home together, side by side this time. The space between them had vanished. Behind them, the town remained in a state of stunned silence, the deed to their children's future held in the hands of the foreign woman they had scorned. The air felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of judgment had been lifted, not by acceptance, but by being rendered irrelevant. They arrived at the house, and the afternoon sun illuminated the garden. It was a riot of life and color. The corn stalks stood tall, their tassels golden. Fat green squashes hid beneath a canopy of enormous leaves, and the bean vines had climbed the crude trellis she had built, their pods hanging heavy and full. It was an oasis, a world they had built together through silent actions and quiet understanding. They stood before it, and for the first time, Gabriel spoke of the past. His voice was low, laced with an old, deep pain. He spoke of a wife and a daughter, lost to a fever on a journey west, a tragedy that had hollowed him out and set him on a solitary path. He had become a gunslinger not out of a love for violence, but because it was the only way he knew to keep the world at a distance, to ensure he would never have anyone to lose again. "I could not protect them," he said, his gaze fixed on the thriving garden. "I built walls around myself so I would never fail like that again." An Li listened, her heart aching for the grief he had carried alone for so long. She understood now the emptiness in his eyes, the reason for his fortress of silence. He was not a cold-blooded killer. He was a man frozen by loss. When he finished, the silence that fell was not empty, but filled with a shared sorrow and a dawning empathy. "My father sold me to pay a debt," she said softly, sharing her own story of loss and powerlessness. "I thought my life was over. I thought this was a prison. But here," she gestured to the green shoots, to the solid frame of the small house, "I have planted seeds. You have provided water." They stood there until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. That night, as she prepared for bed, she noticed her bedroom door was ajar. She walked to it, her hand hovering over the wood, and gently pushed it fully open, leaving it that way. It was not an invitation to his bed. It was a declaration. The walls were finally down. There were no more locked rooms between them. They were simply two people, a man and a woman, standing on a small patch of cultivated earth, ready to see what might grow next.